Hi, good morning everyone. Thank you. Andrew's from the Coal Inspectorate. I'll be talking to you this morning from more the hard rock and mineral mines and quarries side of things. As Andrew indicated, most of the coal mines underground in Queensland are very large seams, so there's not much impact from the rock. It's a very different story in hard rock and quarries. So I'm going to briefly cover this morning some legislation, love it or hate it, we all work within it. We'll talk about the kind of sites that we regulate in Queensland, the highest risk areas that we have, and then we're going to quickly have a look at two case studies, one for a quarry and one for a surface mine. So in Queensland, in mineral mines and quarries, we have an Act, regulations and then guidelines. Coal uses different terminology for recognised standards, but we use guidelines, similar to your codes of practice. We do not operate under any overarching workplace health and safety legislation. We have coal legislation, we have mining and quarrying legislation, and we have workplace health and safety legislation. We're all distinct and separate to each other. So I'm talking to you today about the data that we collect. We love data in Queensland. We're able to collect it from our sites. We have a guideline called QGLO2, which is for the management of respirable dust in mines and quarries. So this document means that sites have to identify, analyse and monitor the risk associated with their respirable dust. They also need to establish and maintain effective controls associated with that respirable dust. We specify that this must be done in consultation with an occupational hygienist, and we specify the competencies that the hygienist and sampling technician must have for that process as well. This means that personal dust monitoring is conducted on workers to quantitatively measure the risk for each worker, and those dust results are reported into the inspectorate. In mineral mines and quarries, we receive that dust data all year round, not just in quarterly instalments. So who is it that we regulate? We have approximately 300 sites of 15,000 workers in mineral mines and quarries. 40% of those are quarries, 15% are surface mines and 3% are underground. And they're our three major sectors, making up approximately 60% of the industry, and that's the data that I'm here to share with you today. So there's about 15 undergrounds, 160 quarries and the rest in surface sites. These are our operational sites. If we include infrequent operations, 300 sites increases to approximately 600 sites. We have about 23 inspectors regulating in this space, and 4 of them are occupational hygienists. As a hygienist, we talk about respirable dust and crystalline silica. We talk about size fractions, how small the dust is. So this slide is really just to showcase what does that mean. If you're not an occupational hygienist, do you know what we're talking about when we say respirable dust and less than 10 micron size fraction? So in the slide you can see a strand of a worker's beard, a piece of hair that's being pulled out. That's the vertical line going up and down. And on it you can see some white particulate. So the strand of hair is approximately 50 to 100 microns wide. The small white dots that you can see on it are respirable crystalline silica particles in the less than 10 micron size fraction. So that's how small it is in comparison to a piece of hair. It's invisible to the naked eye. The large dust clouds that you'll see on mine sites is an inhalable dust cloud, generally speaking, with the respirable inside of that dust cloud. It's the invisible part, not that visible part. So it's difficult to prevent a hazard that you can't see. It also just highlights the importance of respiratory protection. This is how small the particle is sitting on a piece of hair on a worker's beard. So if a worker is wearing respiratory protection and they're not clean shaven, that mask does not have an effective seal against the skin. Those particles migrate through the hair and through the seal of the mask and become inside the mask and inside the worker's breathing zone. So the perception and the effectiveness of that protection is gone. It's lost. So quarries, what are we seeing? The exceedance rate for quarries, as you can see in the first 3 years, started at 9% in 2017-18 and made really great gains. They had over a 1/3 reduction in their dust management and exposure rates in that first 3-year timeframe. At the end of 2020, the exposure limit for crystalline silica halved from 0.05 down to 0.025, and sites had to increase their dust control. So this hit hard in quarries, and as you can see, the levels shot back up and has stayed fairly steady since then. In the last year, we've had 46 crystalline silica exceedances, and 20 of them were more than double the exposure limit. So levels are still high. In almost half of those exceedances, it was reported that the worker was not wearing any respiratory protection. When workers do wear respiratory protection, what's been observed is that it's not effective. Most workers are not clean shaven, have some form of beard, if not full beards, while trying to put on their respiratory protection. So there's a lot of education that needs to occur in this space. Sites have to investigate their exceedances, and inspectors of hygiene also review those investigations to make sure that we can get learnings and move forward as an industry. They have to identify the source of the exposure, review their existing controls, the effectiveness, maintenance, and identify any gaps. And they have to share the outcomes with workers, so there's learnings, and educate the workforce. We've seen a lot of improvements with exceedance investigations over the years due to the educational effort that we've put in from the inspectorate. Initially, some of the investigations simply were 2 lines which just said the exceedance was due to the fact that there was dust in the air. So we've moved on a bit from that, and now sites are looking at their exhaust ventilation and effective controls in that space. So we have exceedances, but how high are they? Not all exceedances are equal. In March of this year, we're still seeing exceedances at 6 times the exposure limit in our maintenance areas. As Andrew talked about, maintenance is a big issue in coal, dust generated from use of compressed air. It's very similar in mineral mines and quarries. Exceedances for maintenance is one of our key areas. Even though the exceedance percentage is still so high at above 6%, we've seen significant improvement in dust management across all sites. In the first 2 years of our dust management process, our worst case RCS exceedance for quarries was at 28 times the exposure limit, again in our maintenance and fixed plant area. Respirable dust, not just RCS, respirable dust was also detected at 10 times the exposure limit. So that was for a quarry cleaner. Respirable dust at that concentration means you'd be unlikely to see your hand in front of your face. When we group our data all together over the past 6 years, we can see some clear trends of our highest risk areas. Again, the maintenance of fixed plant, processing crushing activities, and maintenance of mobile plant and breakdowns. In our surface sites, it's been a very different journey. For the first 3 years in quarries, we saw a reduction. In surface sites, the first 3 years saw the exposure risk grow. In 2020, when the OEL was halved, it grew further, which was expected. And we're still sitting at a fairly high rate, around 6%. There's been 22 exceedances in last financial year. Again, half of them are more than double the OEL, with the worst case at 7 times the exposure limit. You may be surprised to learn that the highest group of exposed workers in surface sites has been the lab workers doing sample prep. I think that was a surprise for everybody versus processing, crushing or out on the floor. The workers in lab prep often use compressed air to blow out the tools of the trade and their spaces to keep them clean. So we need a real cultural change to start using vacuum technology rather than the blowing out of compressed air. The use of compressed air has been a challenge everywhere for us, in fact. If we can prevent the dust getting airborne, it of course can't get into the lungs and cause disease. Again, we have seen significant improvement, even though those levels are still so high. The worst case crystalline silica exposure at initial timeframe period back in 2017 was at 20 times the current OEL. That was for development work with an RC drill. Respirable dust was at 4 times the exposure limit, again in mobile plant breakdown. So we do see exceedances with respirable dust that do not have an associated exceedance with crystalline silica, and vice versa. Lots of silica exceedances with no associated dust exceedance. Again, grouping all the data together, we've got some clear trends about our worst case areas, our export bagging activities, maintenance work, crushing activities, and our lab workers. Moving on to our underground sites, the data trend again, different to the others, initially rose, but then appeared to be under control by the 3rd year. Then the OEL halved and it shot back up, currently sitting at more than 7%. Underground's our highest impacted sector by the change in the exposure limit to 0.025. There were 47 exceedances for RCS in the last financial year and only 1 from respirable dust. So 15 of the RCS exceedances were more than double, ranging up to 5 times the exposure limit. Often reported in underground, no RPE worn at all. Again, in the maintenance, mobile plant equipment and workshop areas, and underground ground control shotcrete activities are our highest risk areas. Respirable dust exceeded at up to 5 times the exposure limit for a shot firer. Again, even though the numbers still look very high, we've seen great improvement in the underground space. Initially, in 2017, exceedances were measured at 52 times the exposure limit. So a little bit more than coal at 1.5 milligrams per cubic metre. Really, really high levels, disease-causing levels. Again, in a little surprise, a lab worker, an analyst, who actually works in a surface role at an underground mine. Respirable dust was up to 5 times, again for development work in RC drilling. In the last financial year, we've only had 1 respirable dust result exceedance reported. So in the history of the database, the 2 worst case exceedances for underground met mines was actually for surface activities. So the results have allowed some very targeted risk assessment to control those exposures, which may have been missed otherwise. Other high-risk areas include the installation of services underground. Often involves the movement of dust and drilling to access the services, development drilling, ground control shotcrete work, and crushing underground and above ground. So that's enough data. We'll just have a quick look at two case studies. The first one's being for a quarry site. So even though our journey in Queensland's been going for 6 years, we're into the 7th year, we have some stragglers, you might be surprised to hear. Not everybody's commenced their journey for respirable dust management in our sites across the state. So targeted inspections have been occurring and questions asked about why that journey hasn't started, and compliance action typically follows. So no formal documented process has occurred in that management of dust. So this is a quarry, a quarry in southeast Queensland. An inspector turned up there in January of 2023. So the picture just shows the inspector standing at, well, you can't see the inspector standing at the gate, but that's what he saw when he turned up on site. This is operations as usual, commencement of day, and there's a fairly significant dust cloud settled over the property. The inspector was also advised that the crushing plant area was mandatory RPE, but there was none observed for the workers on that day. The site senior executive describes it as a usual work day and proceeded to take the inspector around site. This is a screen discharge at 7 a.m. that day. Dust emissions from the tertiary crusher. This is where the inspector actually suspended operations and everything was halted. Working amongst this on the quarry floor was also an open cab bobcat. Again, no respiratory protection available to the worker. The tertiary crusher bar, as you can see, fully blocked. No water coming out of those water jets at all. The sprays were also not turned on many of the other pieces of equipment. The location of the sprays was inappropriate to suppress dust. Pre-start checklists often have check water sprays listed as part of them, but there might be 6 or more water sprays on all the equipment with only one checkbox. Usually the checkbox is ticked, even if they're not working, as was the case at this site. So over the period of approximately an hour, water sprays that were clogged were cleared, water was supplied to the area, and the sprays were redirected. The inspector called in the water truck to wet down the feedstock using the water cart. This control measure was also listed on pre-start checklists and had been ticked as being completed. The plant was restarted. This is a time frame of approximately 1 hour on that day. You can see immediately there's a significant improvement in dust levels. And this is the equipment under operation. You can see the product coming off the conveyor. You can see here the wetting down of the feeder pile and the impact on suppression of dust that it's having by that simple application of water in this scenario. So this is just a highlight before and after. It took 1 hour for existing controls to be cleaned, maintained, to become effective, for the water truck to come in and production to start again. So they had controls, they're not maintained, proved to be ineffective, but it was a relatively simple process to get it up and running again. Just quickly, because I know I'm out of time. This is another another site, a surface site, showcasing an issue which is becoming an increasing challenge for us across all of the sectors. So this is a dozer activity generating dust cloud, normal operations, very dry site, middle of summer. Well, actually winter. It's August this year. These photos were taken. So the dozer's receiving some mobile maintenance. Service crew pulls up next to it. So the process here is actually service crew was called in to come and address the filters for the engine intake. In that dust cloud, you can see obviously there's a very heavy burden of dust in the air which comes in for those engine filters. So the process for them is to clean them, replace them. Separate to the safety and health risk of the workers removing them and walking down the stairs without 3 points of contact. So a very dusty engine filter is placed on a very dusty ground for maintenance. Can anyone predict what's about to happen here? Compressed air nozzle comes out. Dusty filter, dusty ground, let's add some compressed air, hey? I did have a video, but I can't show it to you which was very dramatic, but it showed the company involved, so I had to do some stills. As you can see, the compressed air starts, dust cloud starts, no respiratory protection. There's no controls in place whatsoever for this activity at all, which is conducted several times during the day. Not only that, what about his buddy? Walking right through the dust cloud that's generated. It's getting in his eyes. It's a bit annoying. So obviously this practice has been stopped at this particular site. They also hadn't commenced their dust journey August this year, so it was a targeted inspection. So their short-term controls to manage this, it's a very large site, their short-term controls was to apply loose-fitting PAPR so they could keep working. While that was occurring, the long-term control was to implement a wash bay station so that they could remove the filters and wash them on site, dry them and put them back in the truck rather than blowing them out. Interestingly, for this site, very large spread out operation, the north end, one end, had PAPR for workers doing this activity, but the other end had none. So there hadn't even been a communication across site about that process. Obviously, well, indicatively, there's a lot of other dust issues at this site that need to be addressed, similar to what Andrew's talking about and what Liam is going to talk about as well, with dust control inside cabins for workers. But the blowing out of filters is something we're having an increasing challenge with across industry in Queensland. So just to summarise, we have 3 tiers of legislation in Queensland. Our highest risk areas for dust exposure in quarries, surface and underground mines all differ. However, maintenance is a critical area of the highest dust exposure. Engineering controls, often introduced and established to reduce the dust exposure, become ineffective over time because they're not maintained. Sites need to review current work practices to make change and reduce their worker exposure. Thank you.